The baby wouldn't stop crying, and Nora Pritchard's arms had gone numb an hour ago. She stumbled through the pines with snow collecting in her boots, each step punching through the crust with a sound like breaking glass. Behind her, somewhere in the valley, the town of Coldwater Basin sat wrapped in its judgment and its smoke, and she didn't look back, because looking back meant seeing what she'd left, and what she'd left was a man who'd called her daughter a burden to his face. The wind cut through her thin coat like it had teeth. Nora shifted the bundle against her chest, trying to keep little Emmeline's face covered, 3 months old and already unwanted by half the world. The crying had faded to weak hiccups now, and that scared her more than the wailing had. She needed shelter, needed fire, needed something other than these endless trees and the grey sky pressing down like a heavy blanket about to smother them both. Husband, no, her former husband, she had to start thinking of him that way, had made his position clear 2 nights ago when he'd come home with Conrad Shelby and his ledger book. Thomas had always been weak, but she hadn't understood how weak until she'd watched him nod along while Shelby outlined the arrangement they discussed. A childless couple in Silver Ridge looking to adopt. Good Christian folks with money and land. They'd take the baby, pay off Thomas's gambling debts, and everyone would benefit. Everyone except Emmeline. It's the practical thing, Thomas had said, not meeting her eyes. We can't afford her, Nora, not with the store failing. She'd left before dawn with nothing but the clothes on her back and what little money she'd managed to hide in a flour tin over the past year. $73, enough to buy passage somewhere if she could get to a railroad town. But first, she had to survive the mountains in January. The trees opened up ahead, and Nora's heart jumped. A cabin, small and dark and probably abandoned, but it had walls and a roof, and right now that was everything. She forced her legs to move faster, ignoring the burning in her thighs and the way her breath came in ragged gasps. Emmeline made a thin sound against her chest. Almost there, baby, almost there. She was 10 yards from the porch when she saw the smoke. Just a thin ribbon curling from the stone chimney, barely visible against the clouds, but it stopped her cold. Someone lived here. Someone was inside right now, and she had no idea if they'd help her or turn her away or worse. Stories circulated in towns like Coldwater Basin, stories about trappers who'd gone strange in the isolation, about men who'd done things in the high country that made them unwelcome anywhere else. Emmeline cried out, sharper this time, and Nora's body made the decision for her. She climbed the steps and knocked on the door before her mind could catch up. Nothing happened. She knocked again, harder. The door opened so suddenly, she almost fell forward. The man standing there was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair pulled back and a face that looked like it had been carved with rough tools. He had a beard that needed trimming and eyes that didn't quite meet hers. He looked at her for a long moment, then at the bundle in her arms, then past her at the snow beginning to fall again. You lost. His voice was quiet and rough from disuse. I need, Nora's voice cracked. Please, my daughter, she's cold. He stepped aside without another word. The inside of the cabin was dim and warm, one room with a fireplace taking up most of the far wall. Pelts hung from the rafters, a table and 2 chairs, a cot in the corner, everything clean and spare and organized. Nora stood dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, suddenly aware of how she must look, wild-eyed and desperate, clutching a crying baby like she was drowning, and Emmeline was driftwood. The man closed the door and moved to the fire. He added wood without looking at her, then pulled the kettle closer to the heat. His movements were careful and deliberate, like he'd spent a long time learning to take up as little space as possible. Sit, he gestured to one of the chairs. Nora sat. Her legs nearly gave out as she lowered herself down. She tried to unwrap Emmeline with shaking fingers, checking her for frostbite. The baby's face was red from crying, but her skin was warm enough. Relief made Nora's eyes sting. The man set a tin cup on the table. Steam rose from it. Coffee, drink. She drank. It was bitter and strong and perfect. The warmth spread through her chest like sunrise. What's your name? She asked. He hesitated, like he'd forgotten. Daniel Greer. I'm Nora, this is Emmeline. Daniel looked at the baby for a long moment, something shifted in his expression, too quick to name. He turned and pulled a quilt from a trunk, draping it over Nora's shoulders. Then he crouched by the fire and didn't say anything else. Nora fed Emmeline, trying not to think about how little milk she had left or what she'd do when it ran out completely. Daniel sat in the other chair and pretended not to watch them. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin's corners. The snow was coming down harder now. She could see it through the single window, thick and fast. "Storm's going to last 2 days, maybe 3, Daniel said quietly. "Roads'll be buried." Nora's throat tightened. "I was heading east, to Glenrock." "On foot?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a bad plan." "It's the only plan I have." Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his face she hadn't expected, understanding. Like he knew what it meant to have only one terrible option and take it anyway. "You can stay here," he said, "until the storm passes." The relief hit her so hard she had to look away. "Thank you." He just nodded and went back to staring at the fire. That night Daniel gave her the cot and made himself a bedroll on the floor. Nora lay with Emmeline tucked against her, listening to the wind scream and the fire crackle and Daniel's slow, even breathing. She'd expected to lie awake all night in a stranger's cabin, tense and afraid, but exhaustion pulled her under like a current. She woke to the smell of frying meat and watery morning light. Daniel was at the fire, cooking something in a cast-iron pan. He glanced at her, then away. "There's bread in the tin, help yourself." Nora sat up carefully, keeping Emmeline wrapped. The baby was sleeping, her tiny face peaceful. Outside, the storm had turned the world white and featureless. Snow was drifted against the window halfway up. She ate the bread and watched Daniel work. He moved with the same careful efficiency he'd shown last night, like motion itself was something he'd learned to ration. When he handed her a plate of fried venison, their fingers brushed, and he pulled back like he'd touched a hot stove. "Sorry," he muttered. "It's all right." They ate in silence. Emmeline woke and fussed, and Nora fed her while Daniel cleaned the dishes. She caught him watching them a few times, his expression unreadable. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. 4 years. Alone. Mostly." He didn't offer anything else, so Nora didn't push. But she wondered what could drive a man to choose this, the isolation, the silence, the endless winter. The day passed slowly. Daniel went out twice to check his traps and came back both times covered in fresh snow, his face reddened by cold. Nora tried to help around the cabin, but there wasn't much to do. She mended a hole in her coat with needle and thread Daniel produced without comment. She talked to Emmeline in soft tones, telling her daughter stories about things they'd do when they reached Glenrock, painting word pictures of a future she desperately hoped was real. Daniel sat at the table and worked on repairing a trap mechanism, his big hands surprisingly deft. Once, Emmeline made a cooing sound, and Nora saw him smile, just a slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth, gone almost immediately. "You can hold her if you want," Nora said. Daniel's hands stilled. I'm not good with Barbies." "Nobody is at first." He looked at Emmeline with something like hunger and fear mixed together. "I'd probably do it wrong." "There's not much of a wrong way to hold a baby." Nora stood and walked over before she could second-guess herself. "Here, support her head." She placed Emmeline in his arms, adjusting his grip gently. Daniel went rigid, staring down at the baby like she was made of glass and dynamite. Emmeline blinked up at him with her dark blue eyes. "She's so small," he whispered. "She's getting bigger every day." Something in Daniel's face cracked open, just for a second, and Nora saw grief there, old and deep and carefully buried. Then he handed Emmeline back carefully and turned away, busying himself with the fire even though it didn't need tending. That night, after Emmeline had fallen asleep, Nora broke the silence. "Why did you let us stay?" Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the wind. "Had a daughter once, Mary, she'd be about 4 now." The words landed heavy in the small space. Nora's breath caught. "What happened?" she asked gently. "Fever, her and my wife both, same winter. I was out checking lines, gone 3 days, came back and they were already—" He stopped, swallowed hard. Ground was too frozen to dig proper grave, had to wait until spring thaw. By then I couldn't stay in that town anymore, couldn't walk past their house or see their things or hear people say how sorry they were. So you came up here. Seemed easier than staying." Nora's throat ached. "I'm sorry." Daniel shook his head, not looking for sympathy, just, "When I saw you with your daughter, I thought about Mary, about what I'd have wanted someone to do if it had been them out there in the snow." He looked at her finally. "Why'd you run, if you don't mind me asking?" So Nora told him about Thomas and the debts and Conrad Shelby's arrangement, about leaving in the dark with nothing but fear and determination, about the look on her husband's face when he'd called Emmeline a burden, like she was a piece of furniture he couldn't afford to keep. They were going to sell her, Nora said, and saying it out loud made it real in a new way that hurt. Like she was livestock, like she wasn't a person. Daniel's jaw tightened. Men like that deserve to be shot. Maybe, but shooting him wouldn't have helped me. No, running was smarter. He leaned forward, firelight playing across his face. You got anyone in Glenrock? A cousin. Last I heard, she was there with her husband. They run a boarding house. Last you heard when? Nora looked down. 2 years ago. Might not still be there. I know, but it's the only plan you have. Yes. Daniel was quiet again, that particular silence that felt like thinking. Finally, he said, "Storm's supposed to break tomorrow afternoon. Day after, the pass might be clear enough to travel if we're careful." You think I'm sending you and a baby over these mountains alone in January?" He shook his head. "I'll take you to Glenrock, make sure you get there safe." Something in Nora's chest loosened and tightened at the same time. "You don't have to do that." "I know. Why would you?" Daniel looked at Emmeline, sleeping peacefully in the crook of Nora's arm. "Because someone should have been there for Mary, and since I can't change that, I can at least make sure your daughter has a chance." The tears came before Nora could stop them, hot and sudden. She tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming. Daniel looked away, giving her privacy in the small space. "Thank you," she managed. He just nodded. The storm broke the next evening like Daniel predicted. Nora stood on the porch, wrapped in the quilt, and watched the clouds tear apart to reveal stars so bright and numerous they made her dizzy. The snow had transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable, smooth and white and alien. Daniel came out with a second quilt around his shoulders. They stood together, not quite touching, their breath visible in the frozen air. "Beautiful," Nora said. "Yeah." She glanced at him. "Do you ever get lonely up here?" "Every day." "Then why stay?" Daniel was quiet for a long time, because lonely is easier than the alternative. Lonely doesn't ask questions or expect things, it just is. That sounds like survival, not living. Sometimes survival is all you can manage. Nora understood that. She'd been surviving since Emmeline was born, since before that, maybe. Since the first time Thomas had looked at her with disappointment instead of love, like she was something that had failed to live up to its promise. "What if you could do more than survive?" she asked quietly. "Would you want to?" Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, fragile and tentative, like the first crack in river ice announcing spring. "Maybe," he said, "if I remembered how." They left the next morning with Emmeline bundled in layers and strapped to Nora's chest. Daniel had loaded supplies onto a sled he pulled himself, blankets, food, a tent in case they got caught out. The snow was deep, but he broke trail with steady determination, never complaining or slowing down. They traveled for 3 days. At night, Daniel set up the tent and built small fires that he kept burning through the dark hours. He sang to Emmeline when she cried, old songs in a language Nora didn't recognize, probably something from his grandmother. His voice was surprisingly gentle, and the baby would calm in his arms, staring up at his bearded face with fascination. "She likes you," Nora said the second night. Daniel smiled, a real smile this time, not hidden or fleeting. "She's got good taste." "Questionable taste, maybe." He laughed. The sound was rusty but genuine. Nora found herself watching him more as they traveled, the way he checked every snowdrift before crossing, testing for hidden dangers, the way he gave Emmeline his warmest blanket without being asked, the way he looked at Nora sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, like she was something precious he was afraid to touch. On the third night, they made camp in a hollow sheltered by stone walls. The fire danced between them while Emmeline slept peacefully, and Daniel finally asked the question Nora had been waiting for. "What'll you do if your cousin's not in Glenrock?" "Find work. There's always work in railroad towns." "With a baby. Women manage." "That's not an answer." Nora stared into the flames. "I don't have a better answer. I'll figure it out. I always do." Daniel poked at the fire with a stick. "Could come back to the cabin." Her heart jumped. "What?" "You and Emmeline could come back, stay the winter at least, longer if you wanted." He spoke quickly, not looking at her. "Got plenty of food, cabin's warm, better than trying to make it alone in a strange town." "Daniel." "I know it's not much, I know I'm not." He stopped, frustrated. "I'm just saying you'd have a place, both of you, no strings, just a place to be until you figure out what's next." Nora's throat ached. "Why are you offering this?" He finally looked at her, and his eyes were bright in the firelight. "Because I spent 4 years telling myself I was better off alone, that caring about people just meant more pain when you lost them. But these past few days, watching you with Emmeline, talking to someone again," he shook his head. "I don't want to go back to that empty cabin and pretend survival is enough anymore. And maybe that's selfish, but I don't care, I'm asking anyway." The air between them felt charged, like just before lightning strikes. Nora's mind raced through possibilities, through fears and hopes and practical considerations. Going back meant isolation but safety. It meant time to plan without pressure. It meant being with someone who'd looked at her daughter and seen a person worth protecting instead of a problem to be solved. "What about when spring comes?" she asked carefully. "Then you decide again, stay or go, whatever you need." "And you'd be all right with that, with me leaving?" Something flickered across his face, pain, acceptance, resolution. "I'd understand, but I'd rather have you there for a few months than not at all." Emmeline stirred in her sleep, making small sounds. Nora looked down at her daughter, this tiny person who'd changed everything, who'd shown her what love really meant and what she was capable of when pushed. "Okay," she said, "we'll come back for the winter." Daniel's whole body seemed to relax. "Yeah. Yeah." He smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. They arrived in Glenrock the next afternoon, and Nora's cousin was indeed gone, moved to Denver 2 years prior, according to the new boarding house owners. Nora stood on the muddy street with Emmeline in her arms and Daniel beside her, and instead of feeling crushed, she felt relieved. "Ready to head back?" Daniel asked. She looked at him, this quiet man who'd opened his door to strangers in a storm, who'd held her daughter like she was precious, who'd offered them sanctuary without expecting anything in return, who'd reminded her that surviving and living weren't the same thing. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." They bought supplies in town, things the cabin needed, things Emmeline would need as she grew. Daniel carried everything without complaint. As they walked toward the edge of town where the mountain trail began, a man in a fine coat stopped them. "Mrs. Pritchard." Nora's stomach dropped. She recognized him, Bernard Walsh, one of Thomas's card-playing friends. His eyes moved from her to Daniel to the supplies they carried. "Thought that was you," Walsh said. "Thomas is looking for you, real worried." "I'm sure he is. Says you took off with his daughter in the middle of the night. Stole money too." Daniel stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Walsh and Nora. "The lady's not interested in going back." Walsh's eyebrows rose. "That's so. Well, Thomas might have something to say about that. She's still his wife, far as I know. Not anymore, Nora said, finding her voice, finding steel in it she'd forgotten she had. He wanted to sell our daughter to pay his debts. I left. That makes him nothing to me. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Ask Conrad Shelby if you don't believe me. Walsh's expression shifted slightly, enough to tell her he'd heard something about Shelby's arrangements before. He looked at Daniel, reassessing. This your man now? None of your business, Nora said. But yes, and we're leaving. You can tell Thomas I'm gone, Emmeline's gone, and we're not coming back. He can consider the money payment for 3 years of lies. She took Daniel's arm and walked past Walsh without waiting for a response. Her heart hammered, but she kept walking. Daniel matched her pace, solid and steady beside her. When they were out of town and climbing into the foothills, Daniel said quietly, "That true?" About Thomas wanting to sell her, yes. I meant the other part, about me being your man. Nora's cheeks heated. It seemed like the easiest explanation. Easier than what? She stopped walking and turned to face him. The afternoon sun was behind him, turning his hair gold at the edges, then trying to explain what this is, whatever we're doing. Daniel searched her face. What are we doing, Nora? I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. He smiled, that slow, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. Yeah, me too. He adjusted Emmeline's blanket with careful hands, and the baby made a happy sound. Then he took Nora's hand, and they walked up the mountain together as the sun dipped toward the peaks. The cabin appeared through the trees just as twilight fell, smoke already rising from the chimney because Daniel had banked the fire before they left. It looked different now, not like a stranger's refuge, but like possibility. Like a place where 3 people could build something new from the wreckage of their separate pasts. Daniel unlocked the door and held it open. Nora stepped inside with Emmeline, and the warmth wrapped around them like an embrace. She turned to find Daniel watching them with an expression she'd learned to recognize, careful hope mixed with old fear. You're safe now, he said quietly, like a promise or a prayer. Nora smiled, so are you. Outside, the first stars began to emerge over the mountains, cold and distant and beautiful. Inside, Daniel lit the lamps while Nora settled Emmeline near the fire. The baby cooed and reached for the dancing shadows on the wall. And in the spaces between them, between 3 people who'd found each other in the wilderness, something fragile and essential began to grow, patient as spring beneath snow.